Betty James gripped the steering wheel of her sleek black Mercedes, her knuckles pale against the soft leather. The early evening sun glinted off the hood as she drove through the suburban streets of Richmond, her home for all 18 years of her life. Graduation was just a few months away, and she felt the anticipation buzzing in her chest: college applications, summer plans, the world waiting for her just around the corner. As she rolled to a stop at a red light, Betty noticed the flashing lights of a police car in her rearview mirror. Her heart sank as the sirens blared behind her. For a moment, she wondered if she had unknowingly sped or missed a stop sign. But the feeling was more ominous than that, a sensation that something much darker was about to unfold. She pulled over and watched in the mirror as Officer Amber Wilcox, a stern-faced woman with ice-blue eyes and tightly wound blonde hair, approached her car. Betty lowered the window slightly, enough to be respectful but not welcoming. "License and registration," Officer Wilcox demanded, her voice devoid of warmth. Betty handed over the documents, her stomach tightening. She'd heard stories of black kids in fancy cars being harassed, but she had never imagined it would happen to her. Her parents, especially her father, Captain James, had always assured her that their name meant something in this town: respect, protection, even admiration from their community. But none of that seemed to matter as Amber's steely gaze raked over her. "Whose car is this?" Amber asked, the suspicion dripping from her words. Betty fought to keep her voice steady. "It's mine. My parents gave it to me for my 18th birthday." Amber's eyebrow lifted skeptically. "Your parents, huh? They must be pretty well off. What do they do?" Betty's nerves frayed. "My dad is Captain James, with the Richmond Police Department." There was a pause, a flicker in Amber's eyes that Betty couldn't read. It wasn't respect or fear, it was something more dangerous. Contempt. "That so?" Amber straightened, her hand resting on the butt of her holster. "Step out of the vehicle." Betty's pulse quickened. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I said, step out of the vehicle." Amber's voice turned cold, authoritative. Reluctantly, Betty unbuckled her seatbelt and got out, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see people on the sidewalk glancing her way, but no one stopped, no one intervened. Her skin tingled with the uneasy feeling of being on display, exposed, powerless. Without warning, Amber began to search the car, pulling at the glove compartment, lifting floor mats, rifling through the back seat. Betty stood frozen by the side of the road, panic rising in her throat. She wanted to speak up, to tell the officer she had no right to do this, but her mind flashed with headlines of other encounters between black youth and the police. Her fear was louder than her anger. After what felt like an eternity, Amber straightened up, her eyes hard as she held a small plastic bag in her gloved hand. Inside was a white, powdery substance. Betty's breath caught in her throat. "That's not mine," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not mine." Amber's face showed no surprise, no emotion. "You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance." She cuffed Betty's wrists with a swift motion, tightening the metal around her skin. "I didn't do anything." "You planted that," Betty shouted now, panic breaking through her fear. "Call my dad. Call Captain James." But Amber was unmoved as she shoved Betty into the back of the squad car. Captain James sat at the kitchen table, sipping a mug of coffee and reviewing paperwork from a long day. His wife, Helena, stood nearby, preparing dinner with a contented hum. It was a peaceful moment, a brief respite from the stress and responsibility of leading the police force in Richmond. His life had been dedicated to serving the community, upholding justice, and protecting those he loved. His phone rang, piercing the calm. The moment he saw the number on the screen, a feeling of unease rippled through him. It was the station. "This is James," he answered, his tone professional but with an edge of concern. "Captain, it's Officer Mason. We've got a situation." "It's your daughter." James bolted upright, the room tilting slightly as dread took hold. "What about Betty? What happened?" "She's been arrested," Mason said quietly, his voice tinged with reluctance. "Possession of drugs." The words didn't compute at first. "Betty," His Betty, his straight-A student, his pride and joy, arrested for drugs? It made no sense. A surge of disbelief and anger coursed through him. "There's no way that's right," James said, pacing the room now. "Where is she?" "They're bringing her to the station," Mason replied, sounding hesitant. "But Captain, you need to know something." James stopped cold. "What is it, Mason?" "I saw what happened. Officer Wilcox. She planted the drugs in your daughter's car." For a moment, James couldn't breathe. His mind raced as Mason's words sunk in. Amber Wilcox, one of his own officers, had set his daughter up? The injustice of it struck him like a blow to the chest. He had worked his entire career to root out corruption, to uphold a standard of honor in his department. And now, someone had used the badge to destroy his family. "Are you sure?" James asked, his voice low, trembling with rage. "I recorded it," Mason replied. "She didn't know I was there, but I saw her slip the bag into Betty's car. I've got it all on camera." James slammed his fist on the table, startling Helena, who rushed to his side. "James, what is it? What's happened?" He couldn't answer. His mind was already racing, formulating a plan. He needed to act fast, he needed to save his daughter. Amber Wilcox sat at her desk, cool and composed as she filled out the paperwork for the day. She felt the weight of her actions resting lightly on her shoulders, as if she had merely checked off another item on her to-do list. Betty James was just another cog in the wheel, a distraction to be removed, a pawn in the game she had been playing for years. She had been careful, meticulous. No one had ever caught on to her side hustle, using her position in the department to traffic drugs, framing innocent people when needed. It had been a lucrative arrangement, one that had given her control over both the law and the streets. She had built her empire with cold precision, always staying 2 steps ahead. But today, something was different. The look on Captain James' face when she saw him at the station gave her pause. There was a fire in his eyes, an intensity she hadn't expected. For a moment, Amber felt a flicker of uncertainty, but she quickly buried it. She was untouchable. She had covered her tracks too well. As she finished her report, she glanced up to see Officer Mason standing in the doorway. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his stance that made her uneasy. "Mason," she said, her voice crisp. "Something I can help you with?" He stepped forward, his eyes locked on hers. "We need to talk." Captain James stormed into the police chief's office with Mason at his side, his fury barely contained. The chief, an older man with graying hair and years of experience in handling crises, looked up with concern. "What's this about, Captain?" the chief asked, setting down his pen. James didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Amber Wilcox planted drugs on my daughter. Mason has the proof." The room fell into a tense silence. The chief leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing as he took in the gravity of what Captain James had just said. This wasn't just any accusation, it was a claim of corruption within his own ranks, one that could tear the department apart if it wasn't handled with precision. "Mason," the chief said quietly, his tone sharp, "you'd better be absolutely sure about this." Officer Mason stepped forward and handed over a small device, a body camera he had kept running discreetly. The chief plugged it into his computer, his face growing graver as the footage played. Amber Wilcox appeared on the screen, calm and methodical, as she slipped the small bag of drugs into Betty's car. It was unmistakable. Captain James watched the chief's expression harden. For a moment, no one spoke. The air in the room felt heavy, loaded with the weight of betrayal. The chief exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. This is going to blow up in our faces. "I don't care about the fallout," James growled. "My daughter is sitting in a holding cell for something she didn't do, and one of our own is responsible. This needs to be handled, now." The chief nodded, his expression one of grim determination. "We'll open an immediate investigation into Wilcox. But, James, this is going to be ugly. She's been with us for a long time. If she's involved in something deeper, we might be looking at a network of corruption, not just one bad officer." James clenched his fists. I'm prepared for whatever comes. But you'd better believe I'm not stopping until Amber pays for what she's done. Amber paced in her small, dark apartment, the shadows of her life closing in. Her once pristine world was starting to fray at the edges. She had sensed it the moment she'd seen Mason in the doorway, his eyes filled with something more than just his usual cautious respect. He knew. Somehow, he knew. She couldn't allow herself to panic. Everything she'd built, the alliances, the careful manipulation of the department, the money she'd made trafficking, depended on her keeping her cool. She thought of the people she worked with, the criminals she had used for her side business, the ones who owed her favors. They were loyal as long as it benefited them. But loyalty only went so far when the law came knocking. Amber poured herself a glass of whiskey, her hand steady despite the churning storm in her gut. She was good at this, staying one step ahead. For years, she had managed to hide her side dealings, frame innocent people, and make those who got too close to the truth disappear. But Mason. He wasn't like the others. He was sharp, quiet, and always watching. She underestimated him, and now he had the upper hand. If he'd recorded her. She shuddered at the thought of what might come next. Amber knew what she had to do. It wasn't too late to salvage things. There were ways to deal with Mason, ways to shut him up permanently. She had contacts, dangerous people who didn't ask questions, just handled problems. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. A voice on the other end answered after 2 rings. "We have a situation," she said, her voice steady as steel. "I need it taken care of." Officer Mason sat in the quiet of his kitchen, staring at his phone. The weight of what he had done, betraying one of his own, pressed heavily on his chest. Amber had been his colleague for years, and while he had always sensed there was something off about her, he hadn't realized just how deep her deception ran. Exposing her felt like the right thing to do, the only thing to do. But it had also put a target on his back. Amber wasn't the type to go down quietly. Mason had no illusions about the danger he was in. He had seen too much, and now she knew it. His phone buzzed on the counter, pulling him from his thoughts. A message from Captain James flashed across the screen. "I need you. Now." Without hesitation, Mason grabbed his jacket and headed for the station. Whatever Amber was planning, they needed to move fast. There was no telling how many people she had in her pocket or how far her influence stretched. When Mason arrived, James was already there, pacing the station lobby. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the kind that told Mason the captain was hanging on by a thread. "Mason," James said, his voice tight, "Amber's dangerous. She knows we're onto her. We've got to be prepared for whatever comes next." Mason nodded, his jaw set. "I know. I've been keeping my head down, but she's too smart to not realize what's going on." James sighed, his shoulders sagging. "I've seen this kind of thing before, Mason. Corruption like hers, it runs deep. We're going to root it out, but it won't be easy. She's going to fight like hell to stay out of prison." Mason's stomach tightened. He wasn't just worried about Amber's legal battle, he was worried about her striking back in ways that went beyond the law. People like her didn't play by the rules. "We'll need to watch each other's backs," Mason said grimly. "Amber won't go down without a fight." James nodded, the lines of worry deepening on his face. "We've got to protect Betty too. She's the innocent one caught in this mess. Amber won't hesitate to hurt her if it means getting leverage on me." Mason's resolve hardened. "I won't let that happen." Amber's men moved swiftly. Under the cover of night, they made their way to Mason's small suburban home. Her orders had been clear: make it look like an accident, leave no trace that could be tied back to her. The men she hired were professionals, hardened criminals who owed her their freedom. They knew better than to question her. But Mason wasn't home. When the men broke in, the house was eerily silent, empty. They rummaged through his belongings, searching for anything of value, papers, evidence that could lead them back to Amber's secret operations. But all they found was a home stripped bare of any trace of what Mason had done. As they left, one of the men made a quick call to Amber. "He's not here. Place looks clean. What do you want us to do next?" Amber's voice was cold on the other end. "Find him. And when you do, make sure he disappears." Betty sat in her father's office at the station, her eyes puffy from tears. She had been released earlier that day. The charges dropped once the investigation into Amber Wilcox had begun. But the fear and confusion still gripped her tightly, refusing to let go. Captain James sat beside her, his face hard with anger and sorrow. He had always been her protector, her rock. But even he couldn't shield her from the ugly truths that had been uncovered. "Dad," Betty whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did she do this to me? Why frame me?" James sighed, his eyes filled with regret. "Because I'm your father. Amber thought hurting you would hurt me." She was right. Betty shook her head, unable to comprehend the depth of malice behind Amber's actions. "But she's a cop. She's supposed to protect people, not ruin their lives." James reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "Some people lose sight of what's right. They start thinking they can do anything, as long as no one catches them." Tears welled in Betty's eyes again. "I just want this to be over." James looked at her, his voice firm and steady. "It will be. I promise." Amber Wilcox's arrest sent shockwaves through the department. The investigation revealed a web of corruption that had stretched far beyond anyone's imagination. Officers who had once worked beside her were implicated, and the city reeled from the revelations. Mason was hailed as a hero for exposing the truth, but the cost had been great. Amber's attempt on his life had failed, but the knowledge that she had been willing to go that far left a permanent mark on him. Captain James stood by his daughter's side throughout the ordeal, his faith in the system shaken but not broken. Betty would recover, but the scars of what had happened would take time to heal. As Amber was led away in handcuffs, the icy mask she had worn for so long finally cracked. For the first time, she looked vulnerable, her empire of lies crumbling around her. In the end, justice prevailed, but not without a price. Lies had been exposed, trust shattered, and lives forever changed. But as the dust settled, there was a sense of closure, of new beginnings. Captain James looked at his daughter, and in her eyes, he saw the strength to move forward, to rebuild. They had survived the shadows, and now, they could step into the light. If you like this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.